Have you ever imagined what it would be like to face Satan himself? Not as a metaphor, not as an unseen spiritual struggle, but as the direct and declared target of his hatred and fury. The Bible tells us that only two men in history have endured this confrontation: Jesus Christ and Job. And while Jesus is the Son of God, perfect and sinless, Job was merely a man, made of the same dust as we are, vulnerable, human, limited, and yet he won. He did not win through physical strength, political power, or the wealth he possessed. He won because he refused to let go of his faith, even when everything he knew was torn away before his very eyes. But to understand this battle, we must go back to the beginning, to the moment when God and Satan had a conversation that would change the destiny of one man forever. The book of Job begins by describing him as blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Job 1:1. He was a wealthy man, respected by all, a loving father and a faithful servant of the Lord. His life lacked nothing. His household was full of children, his land fertile, his herds vast. To human eyes, he seemed untouchable. But in the spiritual realm, something was about to unfold. The scene shifts to heaven, where the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and among them, Satan, the adversary, approached with the audacity of one who believes he can accuse anyone. And God, instead of dismissing him, asked a question that rang like a challenge. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. God himself drew attention to Job, as if to say, look at this man, see his faithfulness. And that is when Satan hurled his poisonous accusation. Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him, blessed the work of his hands, and multiplied his possessions? Take all of that away, and he will surely curse you to your face. The essence of the accusation was clear. To Satan, Job's faith was not genuine. It was nothing more than self-interest. He believed that without blessings, without protection, without comfort, Job would show his true colors. God then permitted Satan to touch everything Job owned, but not his life. And so began the most intense trial any human being has ever endured. Within hours, the wealthiest man in the region became the most destitute. Reports of disaster came like relentless waves. Raiders stole his. Cattle fire consumed his sheep. Enemies slaughtered his servants. And finally, the most crushing blow. A mighty wind struck the house where his children were gathered, killing them all. Imagine the weight of that moment, the deafening silence of grief, the feeling that the ground had vanished beneath his feet. And yet, faced with absolute devastation, Job did not curse God. He tore his robe, shaved his head in mourning, and fell to the ground in worship, declaring, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job 1:21. At that moment, Satan realized his first assault had failed. But the enemy is not easily deterred. He returned to the presence of God and pressed further. Skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. Strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you. God then allowed Satan to afflict Job physically, but not to take his life. And so the battle deepened. What followed would test not only Job's endurance, but the very core of his identity. Satan wasted no time, striking Job's body with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job 2:7. He turned the strongest man in the region into a broken figure sitting on the ashes, scraping his skin with a shard of pottery. The proud, respected patriarch had become unrecognizable. Those who once bowed before him now turned away in horror or pity. His wealth was gone, his children buried, and now his health, the last fortress of his dignity, had been breached. The pain was relentless, the itching unbearable, the exhaustion overwhelming. But as heavy as the physical suffering was, it was nothing compared to the emotional siege that followed. The enemy knows that isolation and shame are weapons sharper than any sword. Job's wife, herself shattered by grief, approached him not with comfort, but with a devastating suggestion. Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Her words, whether born of despair or the whisper of the adversary, struck at the heart of Job's faith. She was the one person left closest to him, and now she urged him to surrender. But Job's reply cut through the darkness. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Job 2:10. Even in his agony, he refused to blaspheme. Then came the friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, men who had traveled to mourn with him, but seeing his suffering, could not remain silent. At first, they sat with him in silence for 7 days, an act of deep respect. But when they opened their mouths, their comfort turned into accusation. Instead of lifting him, they tore at him with insinuations. Surely, Job, you have sinned. Surely there is a hidden fault for which God is punishing you. The wounds of their words cut deeper than the sores on his skin. They could not imagine that such suffering could befall a righteous man unless he was guilty. Their limited understanding of God's justice became a cruel weapon in Satan's hands. What makes Job's trial so unique is that it was not a contest of physical might, but of the soul's endurance under the heaviest spiritual assault. Satan had stripped away every earthly reason to trust God, leaving Job with only his raw, unprotected faith. And yet, Job did something extraordinary. He brought his pain, his questions, and even his complaints directly to God. He did not pretend he was fine. He cried out. He lamented. He demanded answers. But he never abandoned his relationship with the Almighty. And that is what infuriated the enemy. Job's faith was not based on blessings. It was anchored in God himself. In the unseen realm, Satan's defeat was already underway. Every moment Job refused to curse God was a blow to the enemy's pride. Every tear shed in prayer was a declaration that love for God could survive without rewards. And yet, the trial was not over. There was more to be stripped away, more questions to be asked, more truths to be revealed, truths not only for Job, but for every person who would one day face the silence of God in their suffering. The silence of heaven is one of the heaviest burdens a believer can bear. Job, once the man of unwavering composure, began to unravel. His voice rose from the ashes, not in praise, but in anguish. Why did I not perish at birth, and die as I came from the womb? Job 3:11. He was not cursing God, but cursing the day of his birth. His life had become a tapestry of unanswered questions, every thread soaked in grief. The days dragged on without relief. His nights were haunted by restless dreams. Every breath felt like a reminder of the weight pressing on his soul. His friends, instead of offering solace, sharpened their accusations. Eliphaz spoke of visions and secret knowledge, implying that Job's suffering was the natural harvest of some hidden sin. Bildad insisted that Job's children had died because of their own wrongdoing. Zophar, with merciless bluntness, declared that Job deserved even worse than what he had received. Their words did not just wound, they distorted the character of God in Job's eyes, painting him as a harsh judge rather than a faithful redeemer. Job defended himself with every breath, swearing his innocence, insisting that he had walked uprightly before the Lord. Yet even as he protested, his heart grew heavier. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would state my case before him. Job 23:3-4. It was not rebellion that fueled his outcry. It was longing for an audience with God, longing for the comfort of his presence, the clarity of his voice. But the heavens remained silent, and the silence was almost unbearable. This is where many would have surrendered, not in the loss of wealth, not in the decay of the body, but in the deafening quiet when God does not answer. Satan's most cunning strategy is to make the believer doubt that God is still near. Yet Job refused to sever the fragile thread of trust. He clung to one truth, even when it seemed madness. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Job 13:15. These were not the words of a man untouched by pain. They were the defiant cry of a soul that refused to let go, even while bleeding. The trial had now transcended Job's own life. He was unknowingly standing in the gap for every future sufferer who would ask, "Why, God?" His endurance was becoming a testimony, not just to his own faith, but to the truth that love for God can outlast the darkest night. But still, the tension hung in the air. How long could a man stand in such agony before he broke completely? How long could he hold on before the silence became too heavy? And then, at the appointed time, the voice Job had been longing for began to stir. The whirlwind rose without warning, tearing across the horizon with a sound that silenced every other voice. Dust swirled like a living wall, and from its heart came a presence so vast, so uncontainable, that Job's breath caught in his throat. Then, at last, the voice he had longed to hear thundered, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." Job 38:2-3. It was not the gentle comfort Job might have imagined. It was not the detailed explanation he had demanded. God did not begin by telling Job why the suffering had come. Instead, he drew Job into a vision of creation itself, the foundations of the earth, the storehouses of snow, the paths of the lightning, the birth of the dawn. Every question God asked was like a mirror, reflecting back the limits of human understanding and the boundless scope of divine wisdom. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Job 38:4. The words did not belittle Job. They elevated God. They reminded Job that the author of the universe was not indifferent to his creation, that the one who commands the seas and calls forth the constellations had never lost control, even in the midst of Job's chaos. Job's anger and confusion began to melt under the weight of this revelation. For the first time since his suffering began, he saw himself not as the center of the story, but as part of something infinitely larger. The trials had made his world feel small, closed in, suffocating. God's words blew the walls apart, revealing an unending horizon. The Creator had stooped down to speak, and that was enough. For 2 chapters, the voice of God rolled like thunder across the heavens, unbroken, unstoppable. He spoke of the wildness of creation, the mountain goats giving birth, the eagle soaring on the wind, the behemoth moving through the rivers. These were not random details. They were reminders that God's wisdom governs the seen and unseen, the tame and the untamable. And if he could sustain all this, he could sustain Job. The revelation did not answer every why, but it answered something deeper, the question of who. Job now knew that the God who had allowed the storm was the same God who commanded the winds, the same God whose purposes were never undone by the schemes of the enemy. The battle had been real. Satan had tried to prove that Job's faith could be bought and broken. But here Job stood, trembling before the Almighty, not defeated, but refined. And then, in a voice that was no longer demanding answers, but overflowing with awe, Job said, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." Job 42:5-6. It was not guilt that drove him to repent. It was the realization that in the presence of such holiness, all other concerns became small. The silence was gone. The darkness was pierced. And Job had seen God. And so, Job's life stands as an eternal testimony that even when Satan strikes, even when everything is stripped away, a man who clings to God cannot be defeated, not because of his own strength, but because of the one who holds him through the storm. This story is not only about a man in ancient times. It is about you today. One day, your trials will end. One day, every wound will be healed, and every tear will be wiped away. But until then, remember Job. Remember that faith is forged in fire. Remember that the enemy may roar, but he cannot claim the soul that belongs to God. If this message has stirred something in your heart, do not let it fade. Share it, speak it, live it. And above all, keep your eyes fixed on the one who never abandoned Job and will never abandon you.